Well, good evening, everyone. Tonight, our services begin with Jordan Chatham leading our singing. Richard Comer will read our scripture from Ruth chapter 2, verses 10 through 12. And J.C. Enlow has our ending prayer. Please keep in mind some of the following events: that on Tuesday evenings at 7, the FBI meets studying Bible land passages. And on Thursday mornings at 10, Global Missions is studying James. There will be a ladies' night out on Thursday night at 6 at Linda Enlow's house, and please sign up if you're going to attend. On the 29th, there's a trunk or treat at the building at 5, needing everyone to sign up to decorate their trunks and hand out candy and such. Then November 5, the homecoming with Terry Smith. If you would like to bring flowers for homecoming, please contact Molly Smith. Please keep in mind the sprinkling for the Stevens and Hewling families, and there are tables in the foyer with a list of the items that are needed. Please keep in mind the individuals who are sick or are dealing with hospital stays and recovery. Arliss and Faye Mock are at home. Arliss had a hospital stay a few days ago, but he's at home now. Please also remember Randy and Loretta Holly, Nellie Coker, Jeannie Fowler, Ramona Beasley, Freddie Brown, David Payton, Dixie Murphy, Marilyn Leary, Sadie Downs, Daisy and Charles Johnson, Myrna Gray, Lee Brown, Arlene and Gaylord Gray, James McDonald, Jeffrey Martin, Mitzi Grubbs, Roy Lee Lindsay, Jackie Pounders, Ricky Howell, Tina Green, and Sophie Grubbs, who's with us tonight. Also Elvis Roberts. And our sympathies go out to the family of Ida Clark, and her funeral will be Saturday at McNeese Morris. Are there any other announcements that need to be made? We'll now begin.
Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge."
Yeah. 383. That'll be our song of invitation. 383. Real quickly, before we get in this, I was asked to make sure to clarify a few things or add a few things to announcements with Joe, and I forgot to get with Joe. For the sprinkling we are doing for the families in need, if you're going to bring items for that, those items need to be here by next Wednesday night. Those tables will be gone by our homecoming. So if you're going to help out with that, like I said, the lists are on those tables. They need to be, those items need to be here by next Wednesday. Also remember ladies' night tomorrow night. If you haven't signed up yet, Miss Linda said there's plenty of time to sign up tonight. And if you don't get to sign up, please come out and enjoy some good fun and fellowship at her house tomorrow night. And then also remember Sunday night we have our trunk or treat. And if you would like to help with the food, we're going to do hot dogs So we're going to need the things for that. If you would like to help out with that, please see me or Paula. And also, if you're going to be here, you want to run a game or decorate your trunk, please sign the list out in the foyer or in the bathroom hallway so we can have an account of who's going to be here and what, how many trunks we're going to have so we can set up for that properly. I think that's all I had. For tonight, I was thinking about what we're studying in Ruth and what happens here in Ruth 2, and that we see Ruth meet Boaz. And we're going to talk about this more in depth in our Bible class. But it is a very interesting thing that happens here with Ruth. In that Boaz comes to Ruth, he talks to her, and he tells her to work in his field without any fear of repercussions, without fear of anybody bothering her. And she comes to him in verse 10, where Richard read for us, when she says, "Why have I found favor in your eyes? What have I done to deserve this?" And then we get to verse 11, and Boaz looks at her and says that all of you've done, all that you have done since the death of your husband, and even before that, has been told to me. I know what you've done. And because of that, he says, may God bless you richly. May God give you a full reward. I thought about that today, and I was thinking about what devotional to talk about tonight. And there was one thing that kept coming to mind, and that is the easy parallel we can see here between what Boaz says versus what we know God will say. In that Boaz tells Ruth is in a spot where she says, I'm unworthy of this. I've not done anything to deserve this honor. And Boaz says, no, you've been what we would call faithful to Naomi. You've been faithful when other people would have run. You have been faithful when other people would have left her. And in the middle of this, he talks about her faithfulness when he says how you left. You stayed, even though your husband died, you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. And I thought about that today, and I thought about the application of that for us. Because what Boaz tells Naomi is the same thing that God tells all of his Christians, tells all of us. He knows our faithfulness. And he knows that to be a Christian, we have to leave our father and mother, leave our worldly life, our worldly family, leave the worldly people that we know, and be joined to a people we don't know. Not that we can't get to know them, but that we didn't know them before. We get to go through a change in our life. And as Boaz tells Ruth, because you've been faithful to Naomi, may God reward you fully. It's the same thing we as Christians are told, isn't it? That if we are faithful and true to God and loyal to Him, He will fully reward us one day as well. So tonight, for devotional thought, I want to take that very simple thought and ask where we are, and ask ourselves, are we being faithful to God? Are we being faithful so that when the end of our life comes, God can take this role of Boaz and say, I have seen your faithfulness. I have seen how you've lived. I've seen how you've served me. Get a full reward. Can God say that about us? Can God say that when He looks at our life, He sees faithful service? If He can't, then we need to change our lives so that He can. Change our lives so that we are that faithful servant of God, that obedient child He's called us to be. Tonight, if you're not being that faithful servant to God, we encourage you to change your life so that you are. If you're not a Christian, we encourage you to become one. Or if you're a Christian who's stumbled, who's fallen away, who's quit being faithful, come back to God. God knows if you're faithful. God knows if you're true. He wants everyone to be true and faithful to Him, so that one day He can reward us, He can bless us with an eternal home in heaven. But in order to get that, we have to be faithful. We have to be true. We have to be pure. We have to be holy. We have to be His people. Tonight, if you're not living a life where you are serving God as His person, as His faithful people, we encourage you to change your life so that you are. And we ask tonight that if you need anything, you'll come as together we stand and as we sing. Prepared where the saints abide, just over in the glory land, to be by my Savior's side, just over in the glory
Would you bow with me? Father, as we approach you this evening, we're thankful that we have an advocate who loved us and died for us to make it possible that we can call upon you. We're mindful also, Father, of the countries that's in turmoil because of war, because of enemies coming at their door and killing their families of the countries. We pray that you'd bless each and every family that's been affected. We're mindful of our country and our leaders. We pray that you'd bless them. We're thankful that we live in a country where we have no fear of coming together tonight to study the Bible. And we're thankful and gracious, Father, for your love for us, for being so good to our country over the years. Pray that it'll continue if it be with your will. As we come together to study tonight, may the things we study enhance our faith, that we'll be growing stronger and with a more deeper commitment to you than we have in the past. Pray that you'd bless each and every teacher and bless each and every student as we come together and study, that we'll grow in the grace and knowledge and bring you honor and glory because of our faith and trust and confidence. Through Christ we pray. Amen.
If you would get your Bibles and turn with us to Ruth chapter 2. Ruth chapter 2. Johnny, if you don't mind, would you check on that back table? There should be a stack of papers on the corner. It says Ruth chapter 2. If y'all will pass those out for me, I'd appreciate it. And Carol, can you make sure we got the PowerPoint clicked? So I've got control. There we go. All right, we're in Ruth 2. The plan is to get through Ruth 2 tonight, and then we'll go into chapter 3 and 4 in the next coming weeks. Now, you remember chapter 1, Naomi has lost her husband, Elimelech, and her 2 sons, and her 2 daughter-in-laws are with her. She sends Ruth back to, Johnny, can I have one of those? And so she and Ruth head back to Bethlehem, where they come from, and that was sort of where we end the story in chapter 1, is that Ruth and Naomi have come back. Remember, Naomi says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, which means bitter. Don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. And then we see from that, we lead into chapter 2, where we see the next part of the story unfolds. And we talked about this last week. If you look at Ruth, the end of Ruth 1, you get what literature would call foreshadowing and setting the story up for what's about to happen. Because you notice the end of chapter 1, verse 22, says, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. So that sets our time frame. The barley harvest is upon them. The barley harvest is about to begin, and that's going to lead into what Ruth is able to do next. And we talk about, in our world, we may call that coincidence, good timing. In biblical literature, we see that more defined as being God's providence. The providence of God, of leading the story, God's hand in helping men and to shape the story. So let's get into Ruth chapter 2. Ruth 2, you remember the background of this is, we've talked about this over and over again, is that in biblical times, all property rights went to the male relative when a man died, not his widow. So Naomi has nothing. She's coming back to Bethlehem. She's coming back to family, but she does not have anything. She doesn't have land. She doesn't have a house. She lives most likely with some of their kinfolk, some of her friends. And so the widow is left to depend on the helpfulness of others. And so that's why when you see biblical literature, you talk about when God talks about the poor, he'll list, even in James, when he talks about pure and undefiled religion, is visiting the widows and orphans, because widows and orphans were the bottom rung. They were the lowest rung of society, because they were the ones who didn't have a male leadership in their home to help take care of them. So this sets up what's about to happen here with Ruth and Naomi. We go from there. Let's see. This is a little further back. Yeah. So next we get into what actually happens in chapter 2. Again, you see a little bit of foreshadowing beginning in Ruth 2, verse 1, where it says, "Now Naomi had a relative of her husband, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz." And so we are introduced to the third major character in this biblical account. First being Ruth, then Naomi, and then Boaz being the three that when people remember this story, these are the three names they remember. And so we find out about Boaz here. Boaz is a worthy man. He is a man that is cited as being a mighty man. King James will translate this, a mighty man of wealth. What this means is that he was well-to-do. He had money. He had possessions. He was able, we're going to see, he was going to be able to take care of Ruth and Naomi eventually. There's one other interesting thing about this description of Boaz, or not this description, one other interesting thing about Boaz that we find out later on at the end of the book, and I want to go ahead and talk about this now, just mention this to you so you know. If you go to the very end of Ruth, and you go to Ruth chapter, hold on, I'm telling you wrong. It's not Ruth that tells us this. It's Matthew. Matthew chapter 1, in the lineage of Jesus, we get a very interesting note about Boaz. If I can find the verse again. Notice verse 5. Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. Matthew 1:5 says, and this is the lineage of Jesus, "And Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David the king." Now, did you catch another interesting Bible connection there? That Boaz is from Rahab. Now, let me go ahead and say this real quick. This genealogy, and this is typically said in the history books, have stated this. What this is this connection between Boaz and Rahab. They're both in the same family tree, but this connection does not necessarily mean that Rahab was his mother. Because if Rahab was his mother, we have a little bit of a problem with our biblical timeline. Because if anybody knows their Bible history, how long were the judges in charge of the land before the kings come along? 400 years. Well, Rahab takes place before the judges. The story of Ruth takes place at the end of Judges. So if Rahab is literally Boaz's mother, either Boaz has to be fairly old, or Ruth has to be, or Rahab has to be 400 years old. What we have found out, or what they have found out, these biblical scholars have looked at these lineages, the genealogies, and what they would do in some of these genealogies, if there was a bad apple, we would call it in the family, they would omit them in these genealogies. They wouldn't list them as part of the genealogy. And so that's what typical Bible historians think happens here, is that there are some generations that are skipped, either intentionally or maybe unintentionally. But the thing about this is that this same thing is lined up with Matthew 1 And then in the lineage of David, it's laid out the exact same way. And like I say, that creates a little bit of a problem when you look at this and think about that there's probably 400 years between the time of Ruth and the time of Rahab. I said it backwards. Rahab was before Ruth. But again, the genealogies doesn't literally always mean this is their direct son. The son can be grandson, great-grandson, great-great-grandson. That's how the Jews did their genealogy. Sometimes their genealogies would skip generations, and we can see this in various places. So when we get to that idea of Boaz, and I bring it up here because we got in notes, is that he is a descendant of Rahab. So he was a descendant of that faithfulness. And again, this would again point us to Boaz's faithfulness in that he remembers that example. The other explanation for this is that this is a different Rahab. But it doesn't really make sense if this is different Rahab, why she's included in the genealogy of Matthew and the genealogy of Jesus if it's not the Rahab we know. Because there's only 3 or 4 women mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus, so she had to be someone important. So I say that to say this man descended from Rahab. This family is a descendant of the family of Rahab, and he was a worthy man. He was one that was able to be trusted and able to be looked at, and that's what we're going to see in this chapter. All right. Yeah. Yeah, and what Joe's saying here is, if you can't hear him, is that Rahab was with Jericho. He was a Canaanite. He was a Gentile. And this is sort of the idea we see that she was eventually accepted. Again, we believe that she became a God-fearer, a believer of the Jews who converted, and therefore she had been part of this genealogy. And again, there was good reason to think there's some generations between Rahab and Boaz. But I just wanted you to be aware of that and know of that in case you run into this as we read on through and try to piece this together. But we do see Boaz is mentioned here as a good man, a worthy man, a faithful Jew is what he's called. And then we get to see the story about what really happens with Ruth and Boaz. Pick back up with me in verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers said, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. All right, let's see what happens here. Notice verse 2. Ruth goes to Naomi and realizes they're in a spot. They need food. They have no food, or very little food. And Ruth says, "Let me go glean. Let me go reap," is what she's saying. Let me go glean the ears of grain. Now what she's wanting to do here is an ancient biblical thing that God had laid out for the Israelites, and that is that when they were going out, this is talked about in Leviticus 19:9 and Deuteronomy 24:19. When they went out to gather their grain, they cut the grain down, then they bind it together, and that was their sheaves. Well, as you know, when you're cutting down grain or cutting down weeds and binding them together, you miss some. You're going to leave some on the ground. What God said was, when you gather your sheaves, any you leave on the ground, they're to stay there. They're not to be picked up. And this was to be left so that the poor of the land could come behind you and get food. You are also supposed to leave a gap along the edges of your field. Beside the road, you are not supposed to cut your grain there. That was for travelers and the poor to come and harvest. And so this is what Ruth does. Ruth says, I'm going to go and follow and glean from these fields. And again, you notice Naomi says, go. That's a good idea. That's a great idea. Go do that, Ruth. And so we get to verse 3. She goes out and she begins to glean in the fields after the reapers. And you notice right in the middle of this, the English Standard in the middle of verse 3 says, and she happened to come to part of the field belonging to Boaz. She happened. Now, that's one of the ways the Bible will sometimes talk about and give us an insight into this is providence. That of all the fields she could have chose, she wound up in Boaz's. It was not by her choice, not by conscious choice, but by what we may call fate, what the non-biblical writers call fate. She chose this field of her kinsman. But in the Bible, this is this idea, this was a God, a providence of God. And you see this in other places, that just so happened that these things worked out. That's the providence of God working. And just so happened she was at this part of Boaz's field. And Boaz was of the clan of Elimelech. He's her family. And then you notice verse 4, we meet Boaz. And notice Boaz comes from Bethlehem. He comes outside the city and comes to his field. This says something about Boaz, that he is able to go to his workers. And he has an interesting thing here, in that he has a pretty good relationship with his workers. Because you notice he comes to them and he says, the Lord be with you. Again, notice capital L-O-R-D. May Yahweh be with you. That was a God blessing. May God be with you. And notice the workers' response to him. Their response back was, the Lord bless you. Yahweh bless you. So here Boaz was. He was a man, as God said, was worthy. And this interaction here shows us that it wasn't a hard slave driver mentality. It wasn't that Boaz was a mean boss, a mean manager, but he was one that was loved by his people. And that's sort of what you see as we continue in this account, is you see the love of Boaz from his workers. Because you notice verse 5, Boaz comes to the young man, the servant, who is over the reapers, who's over the function, because again, Boaz is going to have a couple of these fields going on. He comes to the man in charge of this field, and he says, who's that young woman? Who's that young woman reaping? And again, it's not that he's accusing. He's not getting on to him and saying, why you got her going through your field? But he says, who is she? And then he knows verse 6. The servant comes to him and says, oh, well, that's the young Moabite. That's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi. Now, this gives us a little bit of an idea, I think, here. This was interesting to me. Notice this interaction. Well, notice what is included and what is excluded. This servant of Boaz, I believe, is a Jew who has lived in Bethlehem for a while. Why? Because he says this is the young Moabite woman who came back with who? Naomi. He knows Naomi. Boaz knows Naomi. And we also see this interaction in that he doesn't know Ruth. He doesn't call Ruth by name. He calls Naomi by name, but not Ruth. He doesn't say this is Ruth the Moabite. He says, oh, this is the Moabite woman. The one who came back with Naomi. You know, the one we've heard about. And you continue on that this is the one who came back with her. And again, notice came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. Verse 7, she said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. He says she came and asked. Now again, the law of God was to say we're supposed to let these people do this. But she was even nice enough, and this shows us Ruth, that Ruth comes and says, can I glean? Can I follow the reapers and gather behind them? She asked permission. And then you notice he says, so she came. And here's something else we learn about Ruth. It says she came and she has continued from early morning until now. This is probably mid-morning. This encounter's a little bit before lunch. We're going to see lunch done in just a minute. But he says she's been here. Basically, this servant says she was here when we got here. She's working hard. And she's worked all morning except for one time she took a break. One time she took a break for a short rest. The King James here says she tarried a little in the house. The idea of the house is not a real house. But what they would do in these ancient fields is they would set up a hut. They would set up what we would call a tent, a canopy. they would set up a little hut that had shade where they would sit and rest when they took their breaks. And so he says Naomi went or Ruth went and sat in that shade. That's the only time she's taking a break. She's a real hard worker. And then you notice that after he says this, we get to verse 8, and this gets us closer to our Bible reading tonight, that Boaz then goes to Ruth. Notice verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Now, let's stop there, and we'll get these verses on the ones we read for our reading. Notice, Boaz comes to Ruth, and he says, "Listen." And he gives us this greeting that to us sounds weird. It just sounds weird. Because none of us come up to somebody who's our age or close to our age and who's of the opposite sex and say, "Dear daughter." We don't do that. We don't call people. But in the Hebrew language, this was a common greeting for a woman. This was not derogatory. This was a term of affection to call someone daughter. Just like when Jesus calls his mother woman. That term was not derogatory the way they said it. It was a term of endearment. So when he calls her daughter, this is just their way of saying ma'am or some kind of polite interaction. And so he says, "Listen, my daughter, do not go to another field. Don't leave this field." And you get the implication here. He says, don't leave this field or go to another field. Don't leave this one. He says, but you stay close to my young women. I've got young women working. You go with them. Now, some have brought up the question, and we have to ask this question of what were these young women doing? Were they doing what Ruth was already doing? And if they were, then Boaz wasn't keeping God's law fully. Because he says, stay with my young women. If these young women were gathering the droppings from the sheaves, then Boaz wasn't leaving the droppings for the poor. Or were these young women who were doing something else? We really don't know. But he tells Ruth, you stay with my other young women. And again, you stay with the crowd. Well, why? Notice verse 9. He says, let your eyes be on the field they're reaping. You look at this field. Don't look at another field to want to go look for it, go working in it. He says, but you stay here. And notice what he says. You stay here because have I not charged the young men not to touch you? He says, I've told my workers to not bother you, to not harass you, not assault you. And we're going to see later on, Naomi is going to give Ruth sort of the same idea of saying you're lucky you got that field with a good worker because they wouldn't assault you. Because again, Naomi and Ruth, the same boat. They're widow women. They don't have a male figure in the house. They're susceptible, and people would take advantage of them. And so Boaz is looking after Ruth. He says, you stay with my young women, stay in my field. I have given charge not to touch you. And then he says, notice this next thing, he says, when you're thirsty, when you need something to drink, he says, you go to the vessels, go to the jars of water that I've got, and you drink. What they would have done is, early in the morning and during the day, these young men, they'd have pots, probably stone pots, and these are clay pots, they'd have a pot with their water in it. And they would go draw water, and they would keep these jugs full, and everybody would drink of it until they got empty, and they'd go refill it. And so Boaz is basically, what he's basically telling Ruth is he says, you come in and you work like you're one of my helpers. You stay here. I'm going to take care of you. I will provide for you. I will give you safety. You don't worry about going anywhere else. Don't worry about anything. I've got you taken care of. And then we get to where we talked about in our devotional this morning, that as soon as Ruth hears this, again, you got to think, this is Ruth who has left everything, has given up everything to come to a strange land, and with her mother-in-law, and she's heard her mother-in-law tell the people, don't call me blessed, don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. Things have been going bad to bad to bad, and all of a sudden she gets a blessing from Boaz. She finds this man who cares about her, who wants to take care of her, and she falls down at his feet. she falls down in a way of showing him praise and being appreciative to him. And she asks that question, why have I found favor in your eyes? She realizes that Boaz wouldn't have done this for most people, that this wasn't a common reaction in the ancient world. And she says, what have I done? What have I done to find favor in your eyes, especially me, a foreigner, an alien? That gives us some insight into the Jewish mindset too, doesn't it? Because how did Jews typically view Gentiles? They looked down upon them. They were not Jews. They weren't to be held in the high esteem. And so she knows how the Jews are, but she says, you've treated me like a Jew. You don't even treat me like a foreigner. Why? Well, we get to verse 11. Boaz says, all that you've done for your mother-in-law, since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. Boaz says, I've heard your story. I've heard what you've done. I've heard what happened in Moab. I've heard how you came back with Naomi when Orpah went back. Boaz says, I know the story. I know everything you've done. And he says, because I've heard this, and he knows, he says, how you've left your father, your mother, your native land to come to a people that you don't know. He tells her, he says, I know that you've left everything behind to be with Naomi. And he says, because you've done that, may the Lord bless you. And that's verse 12. May the Lord recompense, or may the Lord repay you for what you've done. And a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Notice the spiritual side of Boaz here. Boaz says that you've come to Bethlehem, you've come to God's people, not to seek physical refuge, but spiritual. You've come under the wings of God. That you've trusted God to bless you. You've trusted God to take care of you. Whether or not Ruth fully understood what she was doing, this is what Boaz says. He said, by coming to this foreign people with your mother-in-law, he said, you're trusting God. You're trusting God to bless you. And then he knows verse 13, her response. Then she says, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord. For you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. Notice, she says, I don't deserve this again. She says, you spoken, basically what it sounds to me like she's saying, you've spoken nicer to me than anybody else has. You've taken me in. You don't treat me like a foreigner. And we continue Boaz's treatment of Ruth. Notice verse 14, and at mealtime. So again, this all happens before breakfast. Ruth's been there early in the morning, and she's still there. At lunchtime. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here. Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. Comes lunchtime. Now, Boaz done told her, you can have all the water you want. He didn't say a word about food. Now he calls her over and says, Ruth, come eat with us. This shows us the prosperity, the wealth of Boaz, that he's able to feed this woman who wasn't planned to be here. It's another mouth to feed. This shows us, I think, that Boaz wasn't skimpy on how he treated his workers. He said, sit down and eat. And notice, not that she sat down and eat, she eats until she was satisfied. She eats till she is full. One commentator I read about this said that it's an interesting thought to wonder how long it had been, maybe, since Ruth had been able to eat until she was full. To eat until she was satisfied. Because with her husband being gone, her father-in-law being gone, her brother-in-law being gone, her and Naomi were scraping by. But yet, we get another glimmer of the beauty of Ruth. And that she eats till she's full and she has some left over. Now, don't lose that idea that she has some left over. Because we're going to see that leftover come into play in just a few minutes toward the end of this chapter. Then he knows verse 15. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. Boaz says, when you gather, when you've got it wrapped up and bundled together, if she takes some of the grain from the bundles you've wrapped up, don't say a word to her. Let her do it. Let her get enough. And then you get, to me, one of the most beautiful things that Boaz does in verse 16 to take care of her when he tells these young men, oh, by the way, when you're gathering it all together, you don't have to be as meticulous. You don't have to be as complete as you usually are. Make sure you drop a little. Make sure you leave a little out for her. Make sure she's got plenty for her to gather. And then again, notice he says, do not rebuke her. Don't get on to her. Don't tell her no. Let her do this. And then you notice verse 17. Verse 17 gives us insight into the ancient world and insight into the character of Ruth. Notice verse 17. So she gleaned in the field that until evening. Then she beat out what she gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went to the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. Notice what Ruth has to do. Remember what the servant said? Ruth's been here since early morning. Ruth works till night. Then she has to beat the grain. She has to glean the grain. Now, I don't know if you know how this works, but this is how you'd glean grain. You would have to have a big, what's called a threshing floor, which was a big rock. And depending on where you were, you would have an animal, an ox, a donkey, that would have a stone you'd have one stone laid flat on the ground. You'd have another stone set on top of that. And then you would either have to physically roll that stone around, or you'd have an animal that would push that stone. And what it would do is it would take the grain, and the head of a wheat, the head of barley, is very hard, crunchy on the end. The seeds you want to eat are inside. So what you would do is you would take that stone and it would roll around, and it would crush that husk. It would crush the hard part, and the kernels would fall out. And then what you would have to do to get the kernels out is you would have to do what they called a winnowing, which was you took a big, almost like a pitchfork type thing, and you would shovel it into the grain, into the husk and the grain, and you would throw it up in the air. They'd build these threshing floors where there was a constant breeze going through them. And you would take these husks and throw them up in the air. And what would happen is the wind would catch the husk because it's just dried grass. And the husk would blow away, and the kernels, the seed, which you're harvesting, falls down to the ground. And then you would collect those seeds that fell to the ground, and you would have to take them to the mill to be crushed into flour that you would then turn to make bread. So what I want you to see here is that Ruth worked all day gleaning. Then she has to thresh her wheat. She has to thresh her barley, in this case. She has to get her barley ready. Well, why? She didn't have food. She has to have this for bread. This is another thing about the ancient world. There were times when people had to do this because they didn't prepare ahead of time. If they didn't get this done, they wouldn't eat that night. And so Ruth is unable to get her grain crushed into flour, but she is able to get it into the grain form. Get the husk out, she winnows it out, and she has the seed. She takes this seed, and you notice the end of that, it says that she collects about an ephah of barley. The ephah of barley is basically equivalent to 3/5 of a bushel. Now again, Boaz's men were gathering bushels. They would have gathered quite a few. By herself, she gathered 3/5 from the fallen mouth parts. This is a pretty big amount. And let me give you this to illustrate this way. I say that to say this, that in the ancient world, the way they fix grain, the way they fix bread, she harvested enough grain to make bread for her and Naomi for about 5 days. She has just provided food for their house for 5 days. Now, Ruth isn't going to stop. She's going to go back day in, day out to continue gathering this grain. And then you notice verse 18. She took this grain. Now, again, notice this idea. She has to go outside the city to harvest. She has to then go to the threshing floor, which is outside the city. Then she has to collect her grain and come back into the city and go to where Naomi is. this is a lot of moving, a lot of going back and forth she has to do. And when she gets into the house, and this is what you see, when she gets into the house, her mother-in-law is amazed. Her mother-in-law is amazed. Why? Because she's got so much grain. Her mother-in-law probably never dreamed she would collect this much grain in a day. Probably expect this much maybe in a week of work or a couple of days, but not in one day. Her mother-in-law is amazed, and then we see the attitude of Ruth I mentioned earlier. Remember, she ate till she was satisfied and she had leftovers. Notice she didn't just throw the leftovers away. Notice middle of verse 18. She also brought out and gave what food she had left over after being satisfied. So she sat down and ate with Boaz and his helpers. And whatever she didn't eat, she stuffed in her pockets. Whenever I think of this story, I think of those, you know, I guess the joke you have of some of the old women when they go to those restaurants to give you free rolls, and they want to, you know, if you've ever been around, I've been around these, got some of my family, but they want to line their purse with napkins and take as many of those free rolls as they can and throw them in the purse to save for later. That's sort of the image you see of Ruth. But it's not because she's being cheap, it's because she wants Naomi to have food. She does this because she's worried about Naomi. And she brings this food out. And we're going to have to stop right here because I know we're out of time. But we're going to see in the next few verses that when Naomi sees what she's done, sees how Ruth has been blessed, she says, whose field did you go to? And this is sort of where we get an interaction here, because Ruth doesn't know the connection of Boaz. And Naomi says, where'd you get the grain? Ruth says, oh, it was in this great man's field who took good care of me, is a man by the name Boaz. And when she says Boaz, and we'll talk about this more next week, when she says Boaz in verse 20, verse 19 she has Boaz, verse 20, the light bulb goes off in Naomi's head. Because Naomi says, oh, really? He's one of our kinsmen. And what we're going to find out is not just our kinsmen, the word, it can also be translated as one of our redeemers. He's one of the men that can marry Ruth and be able to take possession of Elimelech's farm. And so we began to see, again, that this beautiful story of these two faithful people, two beautiful people, and what they did. And I don't mean physical, I mean by their attitude, their actions. You read this story of Ruth, you can't help but see Ruth as a caring, loving woman. And you see the picture of Boaz as a loving, caring, strong man who makes sure this woman who's a relative of his is taken care of. Now again, some have asked the question, does Boaz do this because Boaz has the same thing in mind that Naomi has? I don't know. We have no clue that Boaz ever dreams of this. But we do see him take care of Ruth in a way that goes above and beyond what a typical person would do. But that's more for next week. For this week, we see Boaz's care here for Ruth and how he took care of her in this field. What she's implying there, what I think is that he didn't have to do this for her. That she's saying, I'm not one of your servants. You don't have to take care of me like you do your servants. And that's sort of the context, I think, is she's recognizing the extra care he's putting in for her that he didn't have to do. Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, and again that goes to the idea that she may be again amazed at how well he's taking care of her when he doesn't have to. That's a good point. Yep, it is. All right, we're going to stop right there. Next week, we'll pick back up here in verse 19. We may back up a little bit to get this. But like I said, we're going to stop right there. Hope everybody has a good week.